3 days left, and the matriarch was watching her again. Cade Ellison felt the weight of those amber eyes from 60 meters across the ravine. The same way she'd felt it every morning for the past 11 weeks, a low-grade pressure behind her sternum that her body translated as significance before her brain could catch up. The Vorak matriarch sat on the granite shelf above the eastern den. 700 kilograms of muscle and bone, plated in dark iron gray, fur so dense it shed rain like old canvas. Her broad skull turning with the slow deliberation of something that had never needed to hurry in its life. 2 yearling cubs flanked her, their coats still carrying the cinnamon stripe that would darken to charcoal by their 3rd year. Below, half submerged in the shallows of the ravine, a subadult male cracked tuber roots against a flat stone and ate the pale flesh inside with a precision that looked almost surgical. 3 days until the extraction shuttle. Cade lowered her binoculars and made the note on her datapad without looking at the screen. Day 78, 0614 local, matriarch shelf position alpha, 2 yearlings present, subadult foraging, stone tool behavior confirmed again, direct visual regard from matriarch sustained. 7th consecutive morning. She did not write what she actually thought, which was, "She's deciding something about me." 11 weeks. 78 days of sitting in a ravine on a planet that had been colonized for a century by a species that had never once sat still long enough in this valley to learn what lived here. The Kalahari had drawn their maps, planted their settlements on the southern plateau, and declared the Reth Gorge an apex exclusion zone 91 years ago. Red line classification. No sapient presence authorized. Lethal suppression protocols for any fauna that crossed the sensor perimeter of the nearest colonial town 40 kilometers south. The zone had been reviewed exactly twice in 9 decades, both times by administrative committees that never left their offices. No one had asked the Vorak what they thought about it. No one had asked the Vorak anything, because no one had classified them as worth asking. That was why Cade was here, and in 3 days the Kalahari Territorial Authority was pulling the plug. The matriarch shifted on the shelf, her massive forepaws each one broader than Cade's torso, tipped with curved claws the color of old iron folded beneath her chest, and she settled into the resting posture that Cade had catalogued as position 3, alert but unthreatened, visual monitoring active, body conserving energy, a posture of patience. The matriarch had more patience than any creature Cade had ever studied. Including the grizzlies she'd spent 3 seasons within the Brooks Range before the Xenobiology Fellowship had pulled her off-world. The grizzlies had taught her the most important lesson of her career. An apex predator's first language is stillness. You want to know what a bear is thinking, you stop moving. You stop being a threat. You stop being interesting. You become furniture. And then, if you're patient enough and quiet enough and honest enough in your body, no hidden tension, no masked fear, no weapon you think they can't smell, the bear stops seeing you as a thing to manage and starts seeing you as a thing that simply is. The Vorak had taken longer, much longer, and Cade still wasn't sure she'd crossed that line. The first night had nearly broken her. Not the Vorak had been invisible in the dark, up on the shelf, sleeping in the heap configuration she would later learn was a thermal regulation strategy. What nearly broke her was the sound. Reth Gorge after sundown was a cathedral of noise, the ravine walls channeling wind into a low, sustained moan, the water surface chattering against stone, and beneath it all, a subsonic vibration she could feel in her back teeth but couldn't source. Later, she'd identify it as the matriarch's sleep vocalization, a continuous chest-deep tone that the troop used as an auditory anchor through the night cycle. A sound that said, in the language of vibration, "I am here, the center holds, keep sleeping." That first night, alone in a hole in a rock wall on a planet that wasn't hers, listening to an apex predator hum in the dark, Cade had lain on her sleeping pad and asked herself the question that every field biologist asks on the first night and then never asks again, because the answer is always the same and it's always too late. What am I doing here? The answer was the same one it had always been. She was here because nobody else would sit still long enough. By week 3, she had stopped asking. Her shelter was a ground blind dug into the ravine wall, 3 meters above the waterline, roofed with a thermoregulating tarp that matched the ambient rock temperature so precisely that the Voruk's infrared-sensitive pits could not distinguish it from stone. She'd built it herself in the first week, after the Kalahari escort detail had flown her in by shuttle, dropped her supplies on the ravine floor with visible distaste, and informed her that rescue operations would not be attempted if the Voruk reacted aggressively to her presence. The escort commander, a broad-shouldered Kalahari named Rek, whose faceplates had the deep amber glaze of a 40-year veteran, had studied Cade with the frank bewilderment of someone watching a person walk into traffic. "You understand what's down there," Rek had said. It wasn't a question. "Better than you do," Cade had answered, also not a question. He'd left her standing on the ravine floor with 2 months of rations, a satellite uplink, and a medical kit whose antivenom section was empty because nobody had ever cataloged Voruk bite toxicology. The shuttle's stabilizer wash had knocked her hat off. She'd picked it up, turned around, and found the matriarch watching from the shelf, 60 meters away, amber eyes steady, and she had understood in her marrow that the next 11 weeks were an audition she could not prepare for and could not fake. The Voruk had not reacted aggressively. They had done something worse from the Kalahari perspective. They had reacted with interest. The first 3 weeks had been distance. The troop, 11 individuals, 3 adult females, 2 adult males, 4 yearlings, and 2 infants, had maintained a buffer of approximately 80 meters, adjusting their position as Cade moved through her daily observation pattern. Not avoidance. Assessment. They were mapping her the way she was mapping them, and they were better at it because they had millions of years of evolutionary practice at reading bodies. Week 4, the buffer shrank to 60 meters. Week 5 to 40. In week 6, the subadult male, the one she'd privately named Knuckle, for the way he braced his weight on the second joints of his forelimbs when he climbed, had crossed to her side of the ravine for the first time, sat on a boulder 12 meters from her blind, and spent 40 minutes cracking tuber roots while watching her with one eye. Cade had not moved, had not spoken, had not reached for a tool or a weapon or a recording device. She had sat cross-legged on the lip of her blind with her hands on her knees and let Knuckle look. Week 7, Knuckle brought a second subadult, a younger male she'd named Runt, smaller and more cautious, who positioned himself behind Knuckle and peered at Cade around the bigger animal's shoulder like a child hiding behind a parent's leg. They sat together, 8 meters out, cracking roots in tandem. Cade recorded the session without touching her equipment. She'd positioned the directional microphone on the blind's overhang in advance, pointed at the spot she'd predicted they would choose. They chose it. That was the week she began to understand that the Voruk did not approach randomly. They selected positions relative to the matriarch's sightline, placing themselves where the matriarch could see both them and the object of their attention. Every approach was a performance with an audience of one. The matriarch was the gatekeeper, and the subadults were asking permission by demonstrating they could approach the new entity without incident. Cade had seen the same permission-seeking behavior in wolf packs, in elephant herds, in every social apex species she had studied. The mechanism was universal, only the scale was different. Week 7 also brought the first rain, a 5-day downpour that turned the ravine into a churning gray torrent and confined the troop to the den and the upper shelf. Cade stayed in her blind, her tarp leaking in 2 places she hadn't patched properly, her rations getting damp, her recording equipment wrapped in emergency sheeting. She watched the Voruk through sheets of water and documented something no orbital survey could have caught. During the storm, the troop rearranged itself. The matriarch moved the infants to the deepest part of the den, positioning the adult females as a thermal barrier. The adult males took turns at the den entrance, rotating in 2-hour shifts, each one standing in the rain with his back to the wind, while the others slept dry. And Knuckle climbed down from the shelf in the worst of the rain and sat on the boulder nearest Cade's blind, 10 meters away, in the downpour, cracking roots against a wet stone. He didn't look at her, he just sat there, getting rained on, eating tubers, close. Cade's notes from that day were stained with water, and something she didn't mention in the log. She wrote, "Subadult male Knuckle maintained proximity during storm event, 4+ hours. No foraging efficiency advantage to current position versus sheltered alternatives. Probable social monitoring behavior." She didn't write, "He came to keep me company." By week 8, Knuckle was cracking tubers 6 meters from her position every morning. He did not offer her one, but he left the shells in a line between them, and when she did not touch the shells, he stopped leaving them. Cade knew what that meant. She'd published 3 papers on it. The offering and withdrawal test. A species with social intelligence presents a resource to a new entity. If the entity takes the resource, it is classified as a competitor and managed accordingly. If the entity ignores the resource, it is reclassified as something else, something that exists outside the resource economy, something that doesn't need to be managed, something that might be allowed closer. Week 10, the matriarch descended from the shelf for the first time and crossed to within 30 meters of Cade's position. She did not approach directly. She moved laterally along the ravine bank, her body angled so that only one eye faced Cade at any given time, the monocular assessment posture that Cade had catalogued from intertroop encounters. The matriarch circled her from 30 meters for 16 minutes, then returned to the shelf. That night, Cade sat in her blind and stared at the spectrographic printouts of Vorak vocalizations she'd been collecting and felt something she hadn't felt since the Brooks Range. The terrifying suspicion that she was in the presence of intelligence that her instruments were not adequate to measure. Week 11 brought the incident that changed everything in her notes from hypothesis to certainty. Cade had left her blind at dawn to collect water samples from the upper ravine, a 30-minute excursion she'd done twice a week since arriving, always along the same route, always at the same time. She'd gone 400 meters upstream when she heard the rockfall behind her. Not a natural slide, the sharp crack of stone giving way under weight, followed by a heavy impact and a sound she hadn't heard before. A Vorak distress vocalization, high and raw and desperate. She ran, 400 meters back down the ravine, boots slipping on wet stone, her water containers abandoned. She rounded the last bend and saw it. One of the yearlings, the smaller one, the female, had fallen from the shelf. A section of the granite overhang had sheared away, taking the yearling with it. She was on the ravine floor on her side, one foreleg bent at an angle that made Cade's stomach drop. She was screaming the distress call, continuous, each breath a ragged inhalation followed by a high keening note that echoed off the gorge walls. The matriarch was halfway down the shelf, descending toward her cub, moving with a speed that belied her mass. The rest of the troop was frozen, the adult males rigid on their positions, the second yearling pressed against the den wall, the adult females clutching the infants. Cade was closer. She didn't think about it, didn't calculate the risk, didn't consult the field manual that said never approach a distressed apex predator, never insert yourself into a maternal emergency, never cross the approach threshold that you have spent 8 weeks establishing through the patient accumulation of trust. She crossed the ravine. She knelt beside the yearling. The animal's amber eyes rolled toward her, wild with pain, and for one heartbeat Cade saw the flash of recognition, not fear, not aggression, but the look of a creature in distress seeing something familiar and reaching for it. Cade put her hand on the yearling's side. The fur was hot and coarse under her palm. Beneath it, she could feel the rapid hammer of the animal's heart, twice the rate of a resting human's. "Easy," Cade said. "Easy, I'm here." The matriarch arrived. 700 kilograms, descending the last 3 meters of the shelf in a controlled fall, landing on the ravine floor hard enough to send a tremor through the stone. She was 3 meters from Cade. Her jaws were open. Her claws were out. Every line of her body was loaded for the kind of violence that could take a human apart in a single motion. She looked at her cub. She looked at Cade's hand on her cub's side. And she sat down. Not position 3. Not a posture Cade had catalogued. Something new, a settling, a deliberate relinquishing of threat posture, a 700-kilogram apex predator choosing, in the most critical moment of her reproductive life, to trust the small, furless thing touching her injured child. Cade examined the yearling's leg, not broken, dislocated. She could feel the joint displacement through the fur. She'd reset dislocations in field conditions before, on wolves, on a juvenile bear in the Yukon, on her own shoulder once in a rainstorm in Alaska. The mechanics were the same. The patient was 100 kilograms heavier and had claws that could open her femoral artery. "I need you to hold still," she told the yearling, knowing the words meant nothing and the tone meant everything. "This is going to hurt and then it's going to stop hurting. Ready?" She braced. She pulled. The joint popped home with a wet crack that made the yearling scream once more and then stop. The leg straightened. The yearling's breathing slowed from ragged to merely rapid. Cade kept her hand on the animal's side, feeling the heartbeat decelerate, feeling the pain tension drain from the muscles beneath the fur. The matriarch leaned forward. Her massive head came within a meter of Cade's face. She exhaled a long, slow breath that carried the resinous musk and the mineral dust and the fungal note. And then she did something Cade had never seen her do with any adult outside her own lineage. She pressed her forehead against Cade's shoulder. The contact lasted 3 seconds. The weight of it was enormous. Cade's collarbone creaked. And then the matriarch pulled back, lowered herself beside her cub, and began licking the injured leg with long, methodical strokes. Cade sat on the ravine floor with stone dust on her knees and the matriarch's scent on her shirt, and understood that she had just passed an examination that no academic committee would ever be able to replicate or quantify. Now it was day 78, 3 days left, and the matriarch had just done something new. She stood, all 700 kilograms, rising from position 3 to full height in a single fluid motion that Cade's hindbrain registered before her conscious mind caught up. The yearling scrambled sideways. Below, Knuckle froze with a root fragment halfway to his mouth. Cade's heart rate climbed. Her hands stayed on her knees. She did not reach for the emergency transponder clipped to her belt. She did not reach for anything. The old grizzly country rule held her spine straight. The moment you show an apex predator you have something to reach for, the question of what it is becomes the only question in the room. The matriarch descended from the shelf, not fast, deliberate, each step placed with the certainty of mass and authority, her claws digging shallow furrows in the granite. She crossed the ravine floor, waded through the shallows without breaking stride, and climbed the near bank to Cade's side. 40 meters, 30, 20. Cade could hear her breathing now. Deep, slow bellows work, the kind of respiratory capacity that told you this animal could sprint at highway speed for a distance that would kill most pursuit predators. She could smell her, too, a heavy, resinous musk layered with mineral dust and something organic, almost fungal, that she tentatively classified as a pheromone marker. 15 meters, the matriarch stopped. She stood at her full height, the top of her skull level with the shelter overhang, her forelimbs hanging loose, her amber eyes fixed on Cade with the total concentration of something that had just decided to close a question it had been carrying for 11 weeks. Cade met her eyes. You did not look away from a grizzly. You did not look away from anything that was deciding what you were. The matriarch lowered her head. Not a bow, not submission. A vorak lowering its head was the opposite of what it looked like to a species that indexed dominance on vertical posture. Cade had recorded the gesture between the two adult males during a territorial negotiation in Week 9. Head lowered, throat exposed, eyes maintained. It meant recognition. It meant, I see you. I see what you are. You are not below me, and you are not above me, and you are not outside my understanding. You are a thing I have decided to know. The matriarch held the posture for 11 seconds. Cade counted them because her training told her to count, and because counting was the only thing keeping her from crying. Then the matriarch straightened, turned, and walked back across the ravine. She climbed to the shelf, settled into position 3, and resumed watching. Cade let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Day 78, 06:22 local. Close approach by matriarch, approximately 15 meters. Recognition posture sustained, 11 seconds. First recorded instance. She did not write what she actually thought, which was, I have to stop this extraction. The emergency came 12 hours later. Cade heard the shuttles before she saw them, 3 Kalahari enforcement craft dropping through the cloud deck over the gorge, their stabilizer drives throwing a deep percussive thrum across the valley walls that set the ravine water rippling. She was at her datapad station, uploading the day's behavioral logs to her satellite relay, and the sound stopped her mid-keystroke. Enforcement craft, not survey shuttles, not the extraction transport that was scheduled for 3 days from now. She keyed her comm. Ellison to Kalahari Territorial Authority, requesting identification on inbound craft over Reth Gorge. The response was immediate, which meant they'd been expecting her to call. Dr. Ellison, this is Territorial Administrator Voss. We are advancing the extraction schedule. You have 4 hours to break camp. Enforcement units are deploying a perimeter. 4 hours. The extraction was scheduled for day 81. The council voted this morning. The apex exclusion zone is being reclassified from observation hold to active clearance. You need to be out before the clearance operation begins. Active clearance. Cade knew the phrase from the Kalahari regulatory lexicon. It meant extermination. Armed teams entering the gorge to kill every Vorok in it, because the colonial expansion plan needed the mineral rights under the ravine floor, and an apex exclusion zone was an inconvenience that could be solved by removing the apex. Administrator Voss, the Vorok troop in this gorge shows clear evidence of proto-sapient behavior. Stone tool use, resource offering protocols, recognition posture displays, hierarchical social negotiations. Which is exactly why the clearance was advanced, Doctor. Your preliminary reports reached the council last week. A proto-sapient apex predator with stone tool capability in a zone 40 kilometers from a civilian population center is not a conservation story. It is a threat assessment. They're using tools to crack roots. They're not building weapons. Today, the council doesn't legislate based on today. 4 hours, Dr. Ellison. Enforcement will escort you out. The line cut. Cade stood in the mouth of her blind and watched the 3 shuttles bank west, dropping toward a landing zone on the plateau above the gorge's western rim. She could see the running lights of a 4th craft behind them, heavier, slower, the silhouette of an armored troop transport. They were bringing a full clearance team. Across the ravine, the Vorok troop had heard the shuttles too. The matriarch was on her feet. The yearlings were clustered behind her. Knuckle had abandoned his foraging spot and climbed to the den entrance, where one of the adult females was already herding the 2 infants deeper inside. The entire troop's body language had shifted, shoulders forward, weight on the forelimbs, eyes tracking the sky. They knew. They couldn't parse the words or the politics, but they knew the sound of machinery that had never before entered their territory, and they knew what unfamiliar things in their territory meant. Cade had 4 hours. She packed nothing. Instead, she sat down, opened her datapad, and started composing the most important document of her career. It took 90 minutes. She routed copies through her university uplink, through the Interspecies Behavioral Assessment Board, through 3 independent xenozoology journals, and through the inbox of every council member whose contact information she had obtained during the permitting process. The document was titled Formal Objection to Active Clearance Order, Evidence of Proto-Sapient Classification in Vorok Troop, Reth Gorge, with recommendation for immediate moratorium. 17 pages. 78 days of field notes compressed into evidence that she knew was either the most important xenobiological document since first contact or the longest suicide note in academic history. Audio recordings of Vorok vocalizations with spectrographic analysis showing 47 distinct signal types, more than twice the threshold for proto-linguistic classification. Photographic evidence of stone tool manufacture with sequential modification, proving the tools were not opportunistic but designed. Documented instances of the offering and withdrawal protocol across multiple troop members, demonstrating social intelligence feedback loops, and the recognition posture encounter from that morning, the matriarch's deliberate close approach, the head lowering, the 11 seconds of sustained eye contact that meant I see you as a thing I have decided to know, and the yearling's dislocated leg, and the matriarch's forehead against her shoulder, 3 seconds of contact that represented, in behavioral terms, the demolition of every isolation barrier that 91 years of Kalahari policy had assumed existed between Apex Vorok and everything else on the planet. She attached every data point she had. And in the final paragraph, she wrote the sentence that she knew would end her career if it didn't end the clearance. I am remaining at the observation site. Any clearance operation that enters this gorge will encounter me seated among the troop. She sent it, then she closed the datapad and looked at the matriarch. The matriarch was looking at her. 2 hours and 10 minutes left. The enforcement perimeter took shape on the plateau above. Cade could hear ground vehicles, calm chatter, the high whine of weapons being cycled to active status. Through her binoculars, she counted 16 personnel in clearance gear, armored Kalahari in field plate, carrying suppression rifles designed for large fauna takedown. Each rifle could deliver a kinetic bolt that would drop a 700-kilogram animal at 200 meters. She'd read the spec sheet during the permitting process. The Kalahari had designed these weapons specifically for Vorok-class fauna. 16 rifles, 11 Vorok, 2 infants. She put the binoculars down and walked to the ravine floor. It was the first time in 11 weeks she had crossed to the Vorok side of the water. Her boots splashed through the shallows, and the sound small, insignificant, human carried up the ravine walls. Knuckles' head snapped toward her from the den entrance. The matriarch's ears both rotated forward. One of the adult males, the larger one she'd named Slab for his flat, broad skull, took 2 steps toward the edge of the shelf and stopped, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on her. Cade climbed the near bank. She stopped at the base of the granite shelf, 15 meters below the matriarch's position, and sat down on the bare rock. She did not look up. She did not call out. She sat with her hands on her knees and her spine straight and her breathing slow, the way she'd sat for 11 weeks, the way she'd sat with the grizzlies, the way every field biologist learns to sit when the only tool left is the honest declaration of your own body. I am not a threat. I am not leaving. I am here. Above her, the matriarch watched for 4 minutes. Cade heard the slow shift of weight on stone, the click of claws finding purchase. Then the matriarch came down. This time she didn't stop at 15 meters. She descended the shelf in a controlled slide, her massive body displacing loose stone that clattered past Cade's boots, and she crossed the distance between them with 3 deliberate strides. She stopped 2 meters from Cade, close enough that Cade could have reached out and touched the dense fur of her foreleg, close enough that the matriarch's breath, hot, resinous, deep, washed over Cade's face with each exhalation. Cade held still. Her heart was trying to break her ribs. The matriarch lowered her head, recognition, the same posture as that morning. But this time she held it, and while she held it, one of the yearlings crept down the shelf behind her and pressed itself against Cade's left side. The yearling weighed perhaps 90 kilograms. Its fur was coarser than it looked, wiry, layered, with a dense undercoat that trapped heat. It leaned into Cade's ribcage with the artless pressure of a creature that did not understand the concept of personal space, because it had never lived in a world where distance between pack members was anything but a failure of trust. The second yearling followed. It settled on Cade's right side, its broad head resting on her thigh. Cade did not move. She sat between two juvenile apex predators, beneath the amber gaze of their mother, and she let the tears come because there was no one here who would mistake them for weakness. The matriarch straightened. She issued a low vocalization, a chest-deep rumble that Cade had recorded hundreds of times but had never heard from this close, a sound that traveled through the rock and into her bones. It was the troop assembly call, not the alarm variant, not the defensive variant. The variant Cade had classified as social integration. Come close, settle, this space is ours. From the den, from the foraging grounds, from the secondary resting sites along the ravine walls, the Vorak troop came. The two adult males arrived first, Slab and the smaller male she'd named Ridge, moving in parallel, their massive shoulders nearly touching. One of the adult females followed, carrying an infant on her back. The small creature's fingers knotted in the fur between her shoulder blades. A second adult female appeared from a side gallery, her posture watchful, her amber eyes sweeping the plateau rim above where the enforcement shuttles had landed. Knuckle came last, hesitant, his weight shifting from limb to limb, until the matriarch rumbled again, and he settled 4 meters from Cade with a thud that she felt through the rock. 11 Vorak, 1 human. Arranged on the granite slope below the eastern den, in the late afternoon light, in the configuration that Cade had observed only once before during a territorial consolidation display in Week 7, when the troop had gathered in a tight formation to assert collective presence against a rival noise from the upper gorge. They were consolidating around her. 1 hour and 32 minutes. Her comm buzzed. She answered it without taking her hands off her knees, using the jaw-mounted pickup she wore for field recordings. Dr. Ellison, this is Lieutenant Hask, Enforcement Detail. We have you on thermal imaging. You appear to be surrounded by the animals. I appear to be exactly where I said I'd be, Lieutenant. A pause. She could hear the quality of that silence, the sound of a soldier looking at a thermal display, showing one human heat signature, surrounded by 11 much larger ones, and trying to process the fact that the human was sitting still. Ma'am, the clearance order is council mandated. I have 16 personnel ready to deploy. We will enter the gorge in approximately 90 minutes. I understand. If you are among the animals when the suppression operation begins, we cannot guarantee your safety. I'm aware. I'm also aware that I'm sitting between 2 yearlings who collectively weigh more than your entire shuttle crew, and their mother has been within 2 meters of me for the past 30 minutes without so much as raising her hackles. Your suppression rifles are the threat here, Lieutenant, not the Vorak. A sound on the line, someone in the background speaking quickly. Then Hask again, his voice harder. Ma'am, our thermal shows the large adult female directly adjacent to your position, if it becomes aggressive during approach. Her name is the matriarch. She's the dominant female of an 11-member troop with tool use capability and a vocal repertoire of 47 distinct signals, and she has spent 11 weeks deciding whether I'm worth her time. She decided yes this morning. If your people come down that slope with rifles charged, she'll put herself between me and the threat. That's what matriarchs do. And if your people shoot her, the 2 yearlings leaning against me right now will not survive the next 10 minutes, because yearling Vorak without a matriarch can't regulate their body temperature through the night cycle, and you'll have killed them by making them orphans." Another pause longer. She heard voices in the background, urgent, clipped, the sound of people who had expected this to be a simple pest control operation, and had just discovered that the pest control zone contained a human sitting in the middle of 11 apex predators who were treating her like a member of the family. "I'm going to escalate this." "I'd appreciate that, Lieutenant." The line went quiet. The matriarch had settled back into position 3, 2 meters from Cade. The yearlings hadn't moved. Knuckle was cracking a root against the rock, his movements slower than usual, his attention divided between the food and the shuttle silhouette still circling above the western rim. Slab had positioned himself on a boulder at the edge of the troop formation, his body angled toward the plateau, his posture the one Cade had catalogued as sentinel watchful, ready, placing himself between the troop and the perceived direction of threat. 53 minutes. The matriarch's infant, the smaller one, the female Cade had privately named Ember for the bright cinnamon patch behind her left ear, appeared from behind the matriarch's bulk. She was 5 months old, 9 kilograms, and she moved with the wobbly confidence of a creature learning how its own legs worked. She stumbled across the rock, bypassed her mother's foreleg, and climbed into Cade's lap. Cade's breath caught. 11 weeks of distance, of patience, of becoming furniture. 78 days of sitting so still that her hip joints ached and her lower back had developed a permanent knot, and her skin had taken on the brown-gray cast of someone who lived outdoors in mineral dust. And a 5-month-old infant had just crawled into her lap and settled there with the boneless weight of absolute trust. The matriarch watched. Her amber eyes tracked her infant's path from behind her flank, across the open rock, into the human's lap. She did not call the infant back. She did not tense. She watched with the calm attention of a mother who has decided where her child is safest and is content with the answer. Ember yawned. Her teeth were already sharp, small curved points that would grow into the iron-colored hooks of an adult, and her breath smelled like the milk-and mineral scent that Cade associated with nursing sessions. She turned twice in Cade's lap, the way a puppy turns before lying down, and then she stopped moving. 39 minutes. The comm buzzed. "Dr. Ellison, Administrator Voss." "Administrator, what you are doing is a criminal obstruction of a lawful territorial order. You will be charged, and your university affiliation will not protect you." "My university affiliation expired 6 weeks ago. I've been self-funded since week 6 of this study. Charge me with whatever you want. I'm sitting in a gorge with a 5-month-old Vorok infant in my lap because her mother put her there, and I'm not moving." "A beat, her mother put her there." The matriarch allowed her infant to approach me and climb into my lap. She watched it happen and did not intervene. In Vorok behavioral terms, that is an act of trust so extreme that I have never observed it directed at another adult Vorok outside the matriarch's own lineage, let alone directed at a non-conspecific. She is telling me, and everyone watching, that I am inside the circle. 3 weeks ago this same matriarch pressed her forehead against my shoulder after I reset her yearling's dislocated joint. That's affiliative contact, the same gesture she uses with her own adult daughters. If you send 16 armed Kelhari into this gorge, you will be firing on a sapient creature's nursery with a human inside it, and you'll be firing on a troop that has already classified that human as family. I don't think your council wants that headline, Administrator. Silence. The IBAS formal objection I sent you 90 minutes ago is now live on 4 academic networks. The Vorok meet 4 of the 7 criteria for proto-sapient classification under interspecies behavioral assessment standards. You cannot issue a clearance order against a proto-sapient species without a full IBAS review, and you know that because the statute is in the same regulatory code you used to issue the order. More silence. Cade could hear the weight of it, the administrator's calculations, the political arithmetic. The dawning awareness that killing 11 animals was a footnote in next month's council minutes, but killing 11 animals plus a human xenobiologist who had just broadcast her findings to every major academic institution on the network was a career-ending catastrophe. Dr. Ellison, the IBAS review process takes 14 months. I know. If I suspend the clearance pending review, you will be required to remain on site as the designated observer for the duration. No relief personnel. No additional funding. I know that too. You'll be alone in a gorge with 11 apex predators for over a year. Cade looked down at Ember, asleep in her lap, one small forepaw resting on Cade's wrist, the claws retracted, the paw pad warm through her sleeve. I won't be alone, she said. The administrator made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the noise a career bureaucrat makes when they realize they have been outmaneuvered by a woman sitting on a rock with a baby in her lap. Clearance is suspended. Enforcement units will withdraw. You have your 14 months, doctor. I hope your animals appreciate what you've done for them. They're not my animals, Cade said. I'm theirs. The line cut. Cade lowered her chin and exhaled. Ember stirred in her lap, readjusted her position, and went back to sleep. One of the yearlings, the one on her left, the one whose dislocated leg she'd reset 3 weeks ago, the one who had limped for 2 days and then returned to full mobility with the resilient indifference to pain that made Vorak the apex of this planet, pressed her head against Cade's shoulder. The same shoulder the matriarch had touched. The same gesture. The yearling had learned it from her mother. Cultural transmission, in real time, on the body of a human biologist who was too tired to document it. She sat still. Above the gorge, the enforcement shuttles held position for another 12 minutes. Cade watched their running lights through the gap between the yearling's shoulder and the matriarch's flank, and she waited. And the Vorak waited with her 11 creatures who could not understand deadlines or jurisdictional disputes or the 14-month timeline of an interspecies behavioral review, but who understood perfectly well that the loud things in the sky were either leaving or they were not, and that the human in the center of their formation was not leaving either. The shuttles began to peel away, one by one, their stabilizer drives fading from a roar to a hum to a vibration she felt more than heard. The enforcement perimeter on the plateau went dark, ground vehicles powering down, weapons cycling to standby. She could hear the faint bark of Lieutenant Hask's voice issuing stand-down orders, and beneath that, the frustrated murmur of soldiers told to pack up and go home, because a woman on a rock had found a legal statute they hadn't bothered to read. Slab stayed on his sentinel boulder for another 20 minutes after the last shuttle left. His amber eyes tracked the empty sky, his nostrils flaring, his body language a slow degradation from combat-ready to watchful to simply alert. When he was satisfied, he descended from the boulder with the unhurried gravity of a creature that had been ready to fight and had decided, with visible reluctance, that fighting was not required today. He crossed to the matriarch's position and settled beside her. Ridge followed. The 2 adult males arranged themselves in what Cade recognized as the off-duty configuration parallel, shoulders touching, eyes half closed. A coalition at rest, guarding nothing because there was, for now, nothing to guard against. The second adult female returned from her watchful position near the upper ravine and lay down behind Cade's blind, her massive head resting on her forepaws, her body blocking the approach from the north bank as thoroughly as a fallen tree. She was the troop's second-ranking female, the one Cade had named Broad for the extraordinary width of her skull, and she had never before positioned herself near any human-associated structure. She was there now. She was sleeping. The yearling on Cade's right side made a sound, not a growl, not a whine. A low, oscillating trill that Cade had only heard once before, between the matriarch and her infants during a nursing session in week 3. She'd classified it as a contact comfort vocalization, a sound that said, in whatever language the Vorak carried in their chests, I'm here and you're here and the world is still holding. Cade closed her eyes. The yearling trilled again, and the second yearling answered, and then Knuckle answered with a deeper variant that rumbled through the rock, and then the matriarch answered with a chord so low it was more vibration than sound, and for a moment the entire gorge resonated with the Vorak troop's collective voice. 11 bodies humming the same frequency, including the 2 infants, including the subadult who had been afraid of her for the first 6 weeks, including the matriarch who had watched her every morning for 78 days, and had decided, finally, completely, that this small, soft, furless creature was worth claiming. Cade sat in the center of it, ember warm and heavy in her lap, and breathed. Day 78, 1847 local, troop assembly, social integration configuration, with observer included for first recorded instance. Clearance operation suspended. Formal IBAS review initiated. She did not write what she actually thought, which was, "They just told me I'm pack." The next 2 weeks were the quietest of her life, and the busiest. Without the extraction deadline, without the political clock ticking, the gorge settled into the rhythm Cade had always suspected it had, but had never been able to inhabit fully. She rose at dawn. The matriarch was already awake, already watching from the shelf, already positioned in what Cade now understood was not surveillance, but companionship. The matriarch watched her the way she watched her own adult daughters, with the attentive calm of a creature that keeps track of its people. The morning routine became a ritual. Cade descended to the ravine floor. Knuckle met her at the water's edge, carrying a tuber in his forepaw, not offering it, just carrying it, the way a coworker carries a coffee past your desk without comment. They walked upstream together, Cade collecting water samples, Knuckle cracking tubers against the best stones along the route, the two of them operating in comfortable parallel the way field partners do after months of working the same ground. On the 4th morning after the clearance suspension, Cade knelt at the water's edge to fill a sample container and felt a weight settle against her back. Knuckle. He had sat down behind her and leaned into her spine with the same unself-conscious pressure the yearlings used. 170 kilograms of subadult Vorak, using her as a backrest while he ate breakfast. She held very still, not from fear. From the understanding that this moment was, in the entire history of human Vorak contact, the first time an adult male had initiated sustained physical contact with a human. If she moved wrong, if she flinched, if she did anything that broke the casual normalcy of the gesture, the moment would become an event instead of a routine, and routine was what she needed it to be, because routine meant it would happen again. She stayed still. Knuckle ate his tuber. His shoulder blades shifted against her spine with each chewing motion, and his breathing was slow and steady, and his fur smelled like wet stone and mineral dust, and the particular subadult musk she had learned to distinguish from the adult male's heavier scent. After 20 minutes, he stood up and walked away, and Cade sat at the water's edge and pressed her palms against her face, and felt the hot sting of tears she would not explain to anyone who hadn't spent 11 weeks learning to be furniture. 2 weeks later, the first review team arrived. They came by shuttle, a 3-person IBAS assessment panel. 2 Kalahari xenozoologists and a Tohari behavioral ecologist named Soren, who had published the only existing paper on Vorak social dynamics. A 12-page survey from orbit that had concluded, based entirely on movement pattern analysis, that the Vorak were non-sapient solitary foragers. Soren's face, when he stepped off the shuttle and saw 11 Vorak arranged around Cade's blind in true pressed formation, was something she would remember for the rest of her career. "They're clustered," he said. His voice had the flat quality of a person whose foundational assumptions were dissolving in real time. "They're a troop," Cade said. 11 individuals, 3-generation matrilineal hierarchy, stable territory, tool use, vocal repertoire of at least 47 distinct signals, resource offering protocols, and recognition posture displays directed at novel entities. She paused. They also like having their ears scratched, but I haven't figured out how to quantify that yet. Soren stared at her. Then he stared at the matriarch, who was watching the shuttle with the calm attention of something that had already decided this new noise was not a threat because the human hadn't reacted to it with alarm. How close can we get? You can't. They don't know you. Set up at the observation blind on the far bank and don't move for about 3 days. If you're quiet and honest in your body, the subadult might come look at you by day 4. 3 days of sitting. Welcome to field work. Soren sat. His 2 Kelhari colleagues sat. For 3 days they occupied the far bank blind while Cade continued her daily observation pattern, moving through the gorge with the Voruk troop as it foraged, rested, played, and negotiated the small complex social dramas that filled its days. Knuckle ignored the review team entirely for the first 2 days. On the 3rd evening, he crossed to within 8 meters of Soren's position and deposited a line of tuber shells between them. Soren did not touch the shells. Cade had briefed him. Good, she called from across the ravine. He's testing you. What happens if I pass? Then you're furniture. On the 4th morning, the matriarch descended from her shelf and crossed to the review team's position. She stopped 6 meters from Soren, who had gone rigid, his stylus frozen above his datapad, his Tohari fur oils prickling with the ammonium scent of fear. Breathe, Cade said, slow and steady. She can read your heart rate through your body temperature. If it spikes, she'll classify you as a threat response and leave. If it stays steady, she'll stay. Soren breathed. The matriarch watched him for 2 minutes, her amber eyes cataloging him with the same patient thoroughness she'd applied to Cade for 11 weeks, compressed into 2 minutes because she had already learned from one human what a human stillness meant. Then she turned and walked back to her shelf. She didn't do the head thing, Soren said, his voice strained. The recognition posture. No. What does that mean? It means she hasn't decided what you are yet. It took her 11 weeks to decide about me. You have 8 days before your shuttle comes back. That's not enough. Then sit quieter. Soren's preliminary report, filed on day 6 of the review, recommended full suspension of the clearance order and immediate classification of the Reth Gorge troop as a Priority 1 Proto-Sapient candidate population. His Kelhari colleagues concurred. The report noted, in clinical language that Cade could read the awe beneath, that the Voruk displayed cooperative tool manufacture, vocal signaling with apparent semantic differentiation, multi-generational social learning, anticipatory threat assessment, and targeted social integration behavior toward a non-conspecific individual meaning Cade. The word Soren used in the summary line was unprecedented. Administrator Voss fought it for 3 weeks. The council commissioned a 2nd review, then a 3rd. Each delay was bureaucratic trench warfare, Voss citing jurisdictional precedent, the IBAS citing behavioral evidence, the colonial mining lobby filing amicus briefs arguing that tool use in a non-sapient species was merely mechanical exploitation of environmental features and did not constitute cognition. Cade read the mining lobby's brief on her datapad while Knuckle sat beside her, cracking a tuber root against the casing of her spare battery pack, a tool he had selected from the available stones because its flat surface and hard edge produced a cleaner split. She highlighted the phrase mechanical exploitation of environmental features, looked at Knuckle, and saved the moment in her field notes with a single line. Tell them that. The 2nd review team spent 6 days. On day 4, Ember climbed into the lap of the team's senior ecologist, a Kelhari named Dean who had arrived expecting to debunk Cade's findings, and who froze, motionless, while a 5-month-old apex predator infant turned twice in her lap and fell asleep against her chest plate. She's never done that with anyone else, Cade said, watching from the blind. You should feel honored. Dean stared down at Ember. Her face plates rigid, expressionless by human standards, had shifted into a configuration that Cade recognized from cross-species emotional mapping as astonishment bordering on reverence. Dr. Ellison, this infant is demonstrating generalized trust approach behavior toward non-conspecifics. That's not proto-sapient. That's pedagogical. She's learning from her mother's example. The matriarch modeled trust approach toward you, and the infant is now applying the schema to other calm bipeds. I know, Cade said. I've been documenting it. Dean looked up. How many generations of this behavior would it take to constitute cultural transmission? One, this is it. You're watching it happen. The third review team arrived 2 weeks after the second. By then, Knuckle had graduated from depositing tuber shells to sitting beside Cade while she worked, his massive shoulder pressing against her back with the unself-conscious pressure of a creature that had decided her body temperature was a resource worth sharing. The yearlings followed her on her morning observation rounds, padding behind her like an honor guard made of fur and muscle. The matriarch had begun bringing her a root every morning, not as a test, not as an offering protocol, but as a routine. The way you bring something to the person who shares your space. The way you acknowledge that someone is present and will continue to be present, and that their presence is a thing you rely on. The third team's senior member watched Knuckle lean against Cade while she typed her field notes and said quietly, "He's not tolerating you. He's affiliating." Yes. Affiliation behavior directed at a non-conspecific in a wild apex population is unprecedented. Soren used the word first. I'm hoping the fourth reviewer finds a new one. The fourth reviewer did. She was a human Dr. Murren Lau, comparative ethologist from the Terran Xenobiology Institute, the first human academic to visit the site. She arrived on the supply shuttle that brought Cade's third month of rations, stepped off the ramp with the weathered calm of someone who had spent 30 years in field conditions on 6 worlds, and spent exactly 4 seconds looking at the Vorak troop before she said, "They've got a grammar." Cade stared at her. "I've been trying to prove that for 4 months." "You've been trying to prove it with spectrographic analysis. Come here." Lau pulled a handheld subsonic detector from her kit, military grade, designed to capture frequencies below the range of standard recording equipment. She aimed it at the matriarch, who was watching the newcomer with customary patience. "She's vocalizing right now. Can you hear it?" "No. Neither can I, but she is." There's a continuous subsonic signal, 18 Hz, modulating in a pattern that repeats on a 6-second cycle. That's not random. That's structured output. She's broadcasting her assessment of me to the troop in a frequency range that your microphone can't pick up and that Kelhari auditory physiology can't detect. The Kelhari have been living on this planet for a century, and they literally cannot hear the Vorak talking. Cade felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her. 91 years. 91 years of Kelhari occupation, and the Vorak had been speaking the entire time, in a language that the colonists' biology had made them deaf to. Lau's report, filed 3 days later, used the word sapient, not proto-sapient, sapient, full stop. The word detonated. Administrator Voss filed an emergency appeal. The colonial mining lobby retained 3 independent behavioral consultants who had never visited the site and whose reports, filed within 48 hours of their commission, concluded that the Vorak were large-bodied solitary foragers exhibiting conditioned habituation to a regular food source, the food source being, implicitly, Cade. Cade read the consultant's reports on her datapad, while the matriarch groomed one of the yearlings beside her, pulling burrs from the cub's fur with her claws in the precise, methodical strokes that Cade had documented as allogrooming, a social bonding behavior, observed only in species with complex affiliative hierarchies. She composed her rebuttal in 2 hours. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence quoted the consultant's conclusion. The second sentence noted that the consultants had described the Vorak as solitary, while the review team's own documentation showed a stable multi-generational troop with role differentiation, sentinel rotation, and cooperative infant care. The third sentence asked whether the consultants had actually read the evidence before filing their opinions, or whether their reports represented a different kind of conditioned habituation to mining lobby paychecks. The appeal was denied. Lau's classification stood. The clearance order was permanently revoked on day 112. Cade received the notification by uplink while Ember, bigger now, 12 kilograms, her cinnamon patch darkening toward auburn, was sitting in her lap, turning Cade's datapad stylus over and over in her small dexterous fingers with the focused intensity of a creature reverse engineering a tool. Cade read the notification. Then she gently removed the stylus from Ember's grip before she could chew through the casing and said, "We're staying." Ember looked up at her with eyes that were not quite amber and not quite gold, and held all the uncomplicated intelligence of a species that had been solving problems on this planet since before the Kalahari had discovered fire. From the shelf above, the matriarch rumbled, not the assembly call, not the comfort trill. A new sound one Cade had never heard, a single rising note that started in the chest and climbed through the throat and emerged as something between a hum and a harmonic, a sound that resonated in the granite walls and carried down the ravine until the water itself seemed to vibrate with it. The yearlings answered, Knuckle answered, Slab and Ridge answered from the far bank, the adult females answered from the den. Even the nervous subadult on the secondary shelf, the one who still wouldn't come within 10 meters of the review teams, lifted his head and added his voice. Cade didn't have a classification for the sound. She didn't have a spectrographic model or a behavioral precedent or a cross-species comparison. She had her own ears and her own chest, and the infant in her lap who had stopped fidgeting, and was listening with the total stillness of a creature hearing something important for the first time. It sounded like a name being entered into a record that had existed before language. She would spend the next 13 months trying to prove that, and she would fail, because Vorik vocal architecture operated on frequency ranges that her recording equipment could not fully capture and her analytical models could not fully parse. The sound would remain in her field notes as vocalization 48, unclassified, single instance, full troop participation, semantic content uncertain. But she knew what it was. She knew the way you know a thing that lives below language, in the place where the body's oldest certainties are stored. She had heard it in the grizzly's long exhalation when they accepted your presence in their territory. She had heard it in every apex predator she'd ever sat with, in every silence that stopped being empty and started being full. It was the sound a troop makes when the last question has been answered and the count has been updated. 11 Vorik, 1 human, 12. 2 years later, the Kalahari Territorial Authority published its final reclassification report. The Reth Gorge Apex Exclusion Zone was redesignated as the Reth Gorge Protected Sapient Habitat, the first such designation in the colony's history. The Vorik were formally classified as a proto-sapient species under IBAS Standard 7, entitling them to territorial sovereignty, protection from interference, and ongoing behavioral monitoring by a designated long-term observer. The designated observer was Cade. Her appointment was not contested. Voss signed the designation order without comment. The mining lobby filed a final protest, which was rejected. The colonial press ran the story under a headline that Cade never saw because her satellite uplink didn't carry news feeds, but which Soren forwarded to her 3 weeks later with the subject line, "You're famous." The headline read, "Human biologist saves planet's apex species by sitting still." Cade read it and laughed for the first time in 6 months. Knuckle, startled by the sound, dropped his tuber and stared at her. She laughed harder. The matriarch tilted her head the curiosity gesture, ears forward, One eyebrow ridge elevated, and Cade realized she had never laughed in the gorge before. 11 months of quiet, of measured breathing, of stillness as a language. And now she was laughing, and the Vorok were looking at her the way they looked at anything new, with patient interest and the willingness to wait until it made sense. Knuckle picked up his tuber. He did not resume eating. He held it in his forepaw and watched Cade laugh, and when she stopped, he made a sound she had never heard from him, a short, huffing exhalation, repeated 3 times, his chest contracting with each one. It was not laughter. The Vorok did not laugh, but it was something in the same neighborhood, a vocalization produced in response to the human's unexpected behavior, mimicking the rhythm if not the sound, the way a creature that is paying very close attention to another creature will mirror its patterns without understanding their purpose. Cade noted it. Vocalization 51, subadult male, apparent mimicry of human laughter pattern, 3 repetitions, context, social response. She noted it clinically because clinical notation was the only way she could handle what she was actually feeling, which was that Knuckle had just tried to laugh with her. Ember, now a yearling, had learned to sit in Cade's blind during rainstorms, her bulk pressed against Cade's side, her breath fogging the tarp in slow, regular clouds. She did not sit with anyone else, not with Soren, who had returned 4 times and earned the matriarch's recognition posture on his 3rd visit, but who could not get within arm's reach of the yearlings. Ember sat with Cade because Cade was Pack, and Pack was not a thing you earned through credentials or chose on a schedule. Pack was a thing the body knew. On the last morning of her 2nd year, Cade woke to find the matriarch lying at the entrance to her blind. Not on the shelf, not across the ravine. At her doorstep, 700 kilograms of apex predator who had never in recorded history voluntarily entered a structure built by another species. The matriarch's breathing was slow and even. Her eyes were closed. Her massive forepaws were curled beneath her chin, and her fur smelled like rain and stone, and the deep fungal note that Cade had long ago stopped thinking of as a pheromone marker, and started thinking of as the matriarch's own particular smell, the way you learn the scent of someone you live with. The yearlings were piled against the matriarch's flank. Knuckle was wedged into the gap between the matriarch and the blind's outer wall, his head resting on one of the supply crates. Slab lay across the entrance path, his bulk blocking the approach from the ravine floor, his sentinel posture relaxed into sleep. They had come to her, all of them, in the night without sound, without alarm. They had crossed the ravine, climbed the bank, and arranged themselves around her shelter in the troop sleep formation. The arrangement that said, this is the center. This is where we are safest. This is home. Cade lay in her blind, surrounded by creatures that should have killed her and chose instead to sleep at her door, and felt the weight of belonging settle over her like a second skin. She thought about the grizzlies. She thought about the 11 weeks. She thought about the administrator's voice on the comm and the 16 rifles and the 4 hours she'd been given and the 14 months she'd demanded and the matriarch lowering her head in a gesture that meant I see you. Then she stopped thinking, because the yearling nearest her was trilling the contact comfort vocalization, and Ember answered from outside, and Knuckles' deep rumble joined, and the matriarch's harmonic, the one Cade still couldn't classify, the one that sounded like a name, rose above them all. The gorge filled with sound, not noise. The oldest music there is the sound of a family confirming that everyone is present and everyone is accounted for, and the night is over and the day is here, and no one was lost. 12 voices, one of them human. Cade closed her eyes, pressed her cheek against the tarp, and let the count hold.